Marhaba, ahlan wa sahlan, salam alaikum. Welcome to the fourth component of the Palestine Teach-In series hosted by the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. My name is Sahar Aziz. I'm a distinguished professor of law at Rutgers University, also the executive director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. It's my distinct pleasure today to be moderating this fourth and final part of our Palestine Teach-In lecture series that we have been hosting over the past month. If you would like to see the previous teach-ins on Gaza, Palestine 101, and West Bank and Jerusalem, respectively, please go to the Center for Security, Race, and Rights YouTube channel, and all of those videos are available. You can also find them at csrr.rutgers.edu under the Resources tab and the page called Facts on Palestinian Human Rights. Today is December 8th, 2023. And as a result of nearly 5 weeks of indiscriminate bombing by the Israeli military of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, over 18,000 Palestinian civilians have been confirmed dead or killed. Another 5,000 to 7,000 are under the rubble and missing, presumed to be dead, which brings the total death toll to 25,000 and possibly even higher of Palestinian civilians. We also have more than 45,000 Palestinian civilians who have been injured by the indiscriminate bombing that some have called a carpet bombing by the Israeli military. And we have 2.3 million Palestinian civilians trapped in the Gaza Strip, a 25-mile by 5-mile strip, and where they do not have access to enough food, water, clean water, or medical care because of the last 8 to 9 weeks of bombardment, and because of Israel's intentional and explicitly stated policy of decreasing or excluding altogether any food, water, fuel, or medical supplies or equipment to the Gaza Strip. So together, combined, these policies and these actions, which are certainly war crimes, but have also led many scholars of genocide to determine that this is a genocidal campaign, and it is a genocide that is unfolding. And for that reason, it is imperative that we educate ourselves and that we learn about the perspective of Palestinians and the facts that led us, and the history and the politics that led us to this tragic moment. If you would like to support our work and continue to support our work, I highly recommend you visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, and I ask that you make a donation to the center so that we can continue this important work. And before I introduce our distinguished speaker and expert, Dr. Zachary Foster, I also want to encourage you to attend our next lecture, a panel discussion on December 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. That will be the launching of our groundbreaking report at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights that is called Presumptively Anti-Semitic, Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse. Here's a copy of the cover of the report, which you can also find on our website at csrr.rutgers.edu. So today we will be learning about the history, the politics, the economic impact, the human impact of the decades-long Israeli settlements that have been built in the occupied territories, whether it's the West Bank or Gaza. Dr. Zachary Foster, who will be providing this teach-in, has a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. He is currently a fellow at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, and his dissertation explores the origins of a Palestinian identity in the 19th century and a history of the idea of Palestine. Dr. Foster has published numerous academic articles in academic journals. He's also published in Haaretz, the Palestine Studies blog, Mondoweiss, and other media outlets. He runs an informative digital archive called Palestine Nexus, and writes a newsletter called Palestine in Your Inbox, which I highly recommend you subscribe to online. And so with that, I want to welcome Dr. Foster. Thank you very much for taking the time to educate us, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, excuse me. Thank you so much, Dr. Aziz. And let me go into slideshow mode. Hopefully everyone can see my screen, and let's get started. This is a presentation about Israeli settlements. And so here we're just gonna provide a brief overview of the Israeli settlement enterprise from 1967 to the present. So recall that in June 1967, Israel took control over Gaza and the West Bank, and the overwhelming majority of the settlements built by Israel since then have been built in the West Bank, so that is going to be the focus today. Israeli settlements refer to Israeli civilian population centers built in and on lands occupied by Israel in 1967, and the overwhelming majority of Israeli settlements are exclusively Jewish. Israel has built 144 Israeli settlements in the West Bank, 12 in East Jerusalem, plus over 100 outposts in the West Bank. In total, there are something like 670,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank. 220,000 of them, 220,000 of the settlers are living in East Jerusalem. Many of the settlements are medium-sized cities. We're talking population centers in the tens of thousands, infrastructure, and all the features of permanent settlement. Just to give one example here, the settlement of Beitar Elite it numbers 45,000 people. The settlement of Ariel, located deep in the northern West Bank, it has a population of 200,000 residents. So let's first briefly discuss the legal status of the Israeli settlements. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention states that, quote, the occupying power shall not deport or transfer part of its civilian population into the territory it occupies. The Fourth Geneva Convention also prohibits, quote, the individual or mass forcible transfers, as well as deportations of protected persons from occupied territory. What this means is that 100% of Israeli settlements are considered illegal under international law, even if Israel itself distinguishes between what it calls legal and what it calls illegal settlements under its own, under Israeli law. The extensive appropriation of land and the appropriation and destruction of private Palestinian property required to build and expand settlements is also a breach of international humanitarian law, particularly the Hague regulations, which prohibit the confiscation of private property. As the occupier, Israel is also forbidden from using state land and natural resources for purposes other than military or security needs or for the benefit of the local population. The unlawful appropriation of private property by an occupying power amounts to pillage, which is also prohibited by the Hague regulations and the Fourth Geneva Convention. And it's also a war crime under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The settlements also involve violation of Palestinian human rights. And specifically, it involves the violation of the right to property. In other words, by seizing extensive stretches of West Bank land for settlements. It also is a violation of the right to equality and due process. That is, by establishing a separate legal system for the Israeli settlers in the West Bank, which is in which a person's rights are based on their national origin. The settlers, of course, are subject to Israel's legal system, while the Palestinians are subject to Israel's military legal system. So you have, in many places in the West Bank, you'll have Israelis living literally side by side Palestinians. The Israelis, of course, can vote for the government that controls their lives. They have freedom of movement. They have freedom to travel, whereas the Palestinians who live across the street from them, in many cases, do not have the right to vote for the government that controls their lives. They do not have freedom of movement. They are subject to a completely different legal system. The settlements also violate the right to an adequate living standard. Israel's control of all West Bank water resources, which we're going to discuss in much greater detail in the slides to come, prevents the development of Palestinian agriculture. the settlements also violate the right to freedom of movement, because the settlements involve instituting and imposing many checkpoints and obstructions on Palestinian movement, which are intended to protect the settlements and to protect the settlers' traffic arteries. The settlements are also a violation of Palestinian right to self-determination by severing Palestinian territorial continuity and creating dozens of enclaves that prevent the establishment of an independent and viable Palestinian state. So let's talk a bit about the origins of the Israeli settler enterprise. So for the first decade of Israel's settlement enterprise, from 1967 until 1977, Israel's policy of establishing settlements was driven by the Alon Plan, which proposed annexing the sparsely populated areas of the West Bank, about 50% of it, and then returning to Jordan, the most densely populated areas of the West Bank. So that was the guiding principle of Israel's settlement enterprise for its first decade or so. There was also an effort to return Jews to the pre-1940 settlements located in the occupied West Bank. And so the first Jewish settlement established after 1967 was Kfar Etzion, which was the name of a Jewish community that existed in that area, that in the pre-state of Israel area that Arab armies Arab armed forces destroyed during the 1948 war. Some of the settlement's founders were related to the original community's members. Orthodox Jews have also played a leading role in driving settlement expansion, especially during this first decade. The first settlement established by Orthodox Jews was in Kiryat Arba in 1968, which was a religious community adjacent to the West Bank city of Hebron, Hebron in Hebrew, Khalil in Arabic. As was often the case, the settlement construction began without state authorization and was later given official recognition and authorized to continue construction in 1970. Let's talk in a little bit more detail about some of the settlements that were established in the 1970s. And in particular, I would like to draw attention to the settlement of Gittit. So in 1971, about 4,000 Palestinians were living in the village of Aqraba, cultivating 145,000 dunams of agricultural land. And Israel decided that it wanted to establish a Jewish settlement there, which it did in 1973. That settlement was known as Gittit. And in order to take over this land, Israel declared the village's land a military training zone. This was a very common practice up until about 1979. Whenever Israel wanted to take control over an area, it would declare the area a closed military zone or a military training zone. But when that failed to convince the residents to leave, Israeli soldiers sabotaged and destroyed the village's farming equipment, and then they destroyed the village's crops. But that also failed to convince the residents to leave. And so Israel decided to use a crop duster to spread toxic chemicals over the village land. This was reported out in Haaretz explosive investigation. And the substance used was lethal for animals and quite dangerous for humans. But in the end, it was effective in forcing the residents out of their village. The Israeli military took over the land in May 1973, and the Jewish settlement of Gittit was then established in 1975. I'd like to also draw attention to Israeli settlements in East Jerusalem, one of Israel's primary areas of settlement expansion. From 1967 onwards, the Israeli government established a dozen plus settlements in East Jerusalem, like Ramot, Gilo, Piskat Ze'ev, Har Choma, and French Hill. To Israelis, these are not even considered settlements. They're just part of the Jewish landscape of Jerusalem. They were built on land unilaterally annexed to Jerusalem, expropriated from Palestinians for Jewish development. Some 50,000 residential units were built in these neighborhoods. More than 190,000 Israelis live in them today. These Israeli settlers are oftentimes excluded from official counts, even though they were built on occupied land, just like all of the rest of the settlements, and even though they are built illegally, according to international law, just like the rest of the Israeli settlements. Israel's goal with its settlement enterprise in East Jerusalem, as you can see here in the map picture to the right, is to encircle Palestinian neighborhoods of the city, thus isolating and separating Palestinian East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank. So that East Jerusalem could not ever become the capital of a future Palestinian state, and thus it's very important to recall that these settlements were built very strategically in strategic locations for the explicit purpose of preventing Jerusalem from becoming the capital of a Palestinian state. And here, I think this graph gives you a sense of the one-way direction in which Israel has proceeded to expand its settler enterprise. Roughly, the number of Israeli settlers living in the West Bank has doubled roughly every 10 years or so. This growth has been driven by government subsidies and incentives, cheaper housing, natural population growth, as well as religious and ideological motives. The first real explosion in the growth of the settlement enterprise really took place in the 1980s. From 1982 until 1988, Israel tripled its settler population. And of course, this was the period that led up to the first uprising, the first Intifada, during which Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza rose up primarily in a nonviolent way, rejecting occupation. And I think the settlement growth during the 6 years prior to that uprising played a key role in understanding why it is that Palestinians rose up. I also want to point out that I think that the settlement enterprise is one of the key reasons that international legal experts describe the situation in the West Bank as an apartheid system. Israel's claim that its occupation is temporary becomes all the more implausible when you look at this graph and when you look at the number of the expansion of the Israeli settlement enterprise. It's really ground zero for the accusation of apartheid because recall, as we already pointed out, settlers and Palestinians live side by side. In Hebron, they live across the street from each other. In Jerusalem, they live across the street from each other. In Sebastia, in the northern West Bank, they live across highways from each other. So when you have a situation in which you have 3 million Palestinians who have no political rights, cannot vote for the government that controls their lives, and they live across the street, in many cases, from the Israeli settlers who have full rights in Israel, who can vote for the government that controls their lives, that is the situation that has led almost every human rights organization in the world to describe this as an apartheid system. And I would say the impact of the settlers and the settlement growth is that it has led to more land confiscations, and it has led, as we're going to discuss in the previous slides, the construction of more Israeli-only roads, more checkpoints, less water for Palestinians, and in general, less space for Palestinian development and Palestinian prosperity. And I'd like to briefly talk about the strategy which Israel has employed and deployed in the West Bank in order to expand the settlement enterprise. Prior to 1979, the primary strategy by which Israel took over land in the West Bank was through a declaration of closed military zones, which you can see here pictured on the right. Anything that is pictured in turquoise or blue or yellow or orange was declared a closed military zone by Israel. And you can see the obvious concentration in the Jordan Valley and the border with Jordan. And that was not a coincidence, right? That is the land that Israel wants to maintain permanent military control over. And thus it's a land that it prevents Palestinians from developing anything, and also has been an area of growth, especially in the past 10 to 15 years, for Israeli settlement expansion. But then in 1979, an Israeli high court ruling made it difficult for Israel to continue building settlements on privately owned Palestinian land through the practice of declaring closed military zones. So in order to overcome this obstacle, the Israeli government came up with a clever workaround in which it would first declare the Palestinian land as state land, and then it could then transfer that land into the hands of Israeli settlers and establish Israeli settlements. And so from 1979 until 1992, Israel declared something like 90,000 hectares of land in the West Bank as state land, and then allocated that land for Jewish settlements. And in total, something like 120,000 hectares, which is about 22% of the West Bank, have been designated as state land and are under full Israeli control. B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization, also found that something like 21% of the built-up area of Israeli settlements is land that Israel itself acknowledges was land stolen from Palestinians. It was privately owned Palestinian land. And of course, it's important to remember that Palestinians very rarely win appeals against their land being declared government property. Let's briefly talk about the role that the Israeli government plays in the expansion of the settlement enterprise. So most settlements in the West Bank hold the status of National Priority Area A, which is an Israeli legal term that entitles these settlements to a number of benefits, and it entitles the settlers in them to a number of benefits. In other words, the Israeli government is actively encouraging and promoting its own civilian population to move into the Israeli settlements through the following policies. The first is through in its policies of subsidizing the mortgages. In housing, it's much easier to get a low-cost mortgage and an inexpensive apartment in an Israeli settlement than it is in Israel proper. In education as well, Israeli settlers benefit from free education from the age of 3. They benefit from extended school days and free transportation to schools. And the teachers who work in the Israeli settlements also benefit from higher teacher salaries. Israel also incentivizes the construction of industrial and agricultural development in the settlement areas through subsidies and grants, as well as through tax benefits. And then in taxation, Israel imposes significantly lower taxes in communities inside the Green Line, and thus providing larger grants to settlements, as well as aid in order to cover deficits. The settlements have also led to the cantonization of the West Bank, as you can see here pictured in the map on the right, which depicts the Palestinian population centers, which are surrounded in these islands by total Israeli control. Palestinians are thus confined to 165 non-contiguous territorial islands that can be severed one from the other at any time for any reason, and often have been severed one from the other arbitrarily. Many Jewish settlements in the West Bank were established with the explicit purpose of thwarting the expansion of Palestinian development and Palestinian urban development. For example, the settlement construction in the mountain ridge, which is basically the ridge that divides the urban centers, which are primarily located on the western side of the West Bank, from the Palestinians on the eastern side of the West Bank in the Jordan Valley. And those settlements were built with the explicit purpose of preventing a Palestinian development eastward. In the words of then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon in 2001, quote, "It's not by accident that the settlements are located where they are. Come what may, we have to hold the Western Security Area, which is adjacent to the Green Line. We also have to hold the Eastern Security Area along the Jordan River and the roads linking the two, and of course, Jerusalem and the Hill Aquifer." And he's really giving you a sense here of where Israel has decided to build settlements, right? It's on the western border with the Green Line, the line that separates Israel proper from the West Bank, and then of course on the eastern border with Jordan to prevent Palestinians from being able to establish territorial control over its own eastern border, and then of course in the area surrounding Jerusalem to prevent Palestinians from creating a capital in East Jerusalem, and then of course wherever there are major aquifers in the West Bank, like there is a big one just below the Israeli settlement of Ariel. So the settlements are very strategic to control the land and its resources and its borders. Let's talk a bit about the water usage of the settlers. So there's a dramatic disparity in the amount of water that the Palestinians are able to access as compared to the Israeli settlers. Something like 4 to 5x. The Israeli settlers consume something like 4 to 5x more water than Palestinians in the West Bank. While Palestinians are not permitted to access new water resources without permits that are usually denied, most new Israeli settlements get connected to the Israeli national water supply as a matter of course. And so, for example, between 2010 and 2016, Israel permitted Palestinians to build 2 new water wells while demolishing 11 water wells. Recall that if you are a Palestinian in the occupied territory, you need a permit to collect rainwater through a water cistern. You need a permit to drill a new well. You need a permit to deepen an existing well. Whereas, of course, if you're an Israeli settler or an Israeli settlement, there are no such restrictions. You're automatically connected to the Israeli water grid, and you have basically as much access, as much water as you like. The Israeli settlements also consume a tremendous amount of water for industrial use to benefit Israeli companies and firms established in the occupied territories, such as dairy farms and vineyards and orchards. Palestinians in the Jordan Valley, in particular, have been systematically deprived of their traditional means of livelihood as farmers and herders. And let me just add an anecdote here. A few months ago, I was visiting a Palestinian village in the Jordan Valley. The Palestinian really was not a village. It's more so just a collection of homes in the northern West Bank, in the village of Khumsa. And on a daily basis, Israeli settlers in the surrounding areas approach the Palestinians on their land, harassing them, stealing their, destroying their water tanks, causing destruction to their farms. So we're talking about a situation in Israeli settlers have total impunity to harass Palestinian shepherding communities and farmers, destroy the little water they have access to in the first place. Let's talk a bit about the E1 zone, and this is the zone located directly to the east of Jerusalem. It's an area that is a very sensitive area that Israel has long sought control over, and it has developed a plan to take over this area and to annex it into Israel. It's located just to the east of Jerusalem, and the goal has been to restrict Palestinian development in this area as well as in Jerusalem, to bisect the West Bank into northern and southern parts, further cantonizing the Palestinians in the West Bank and giving Israel an even greater military edge over over every aspect of Palestinian life in the West Bank. About 180 Palestinian Bedouins have faced eviction in the Khan al-Ahmar area, which is a Palestinian community located in the E1 zone. And this area has also become a source of discussion in the United States. You had in 2022 something like 29 Democrats in the U.S. Congress call on the Biden administration to pressure Israel to prevent construction of yet another settlement between Jerusalem and the West Bank. Between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea in the E1 zone. And on July 4th, 2022, Israel delayed a hearing to advance the E1 project. Over the past 10, 20, 30 years, you keep getting these delays, right? Israel has declared its goal of establishing new settlements in that region for decades. And every time you get American criticism, Israel pushes off. A delay and obfuscate, I would say, is the goal, but never cancel. The plan is on the table. It has been on the table for decades. And owing to American pressure, they have pushed it off. But of course, it's still on the docket and could be prioritized for Jewish settlement at any time. Let's talk a bit about settler violence, which has gotten much, much worse in the past couple of years. Settler violence has intensified. Settlers frequently stone and shoot at Palestinian cars, burn down their fields, harass children walking to school, and physically assaulting Palestinians. This has been the case for decades. Already dating back to the 1990s and 2000s, you had activists, Israeli activists, international activists locating themselves in Palestinian villages around the West Bank in places like 20 and the South Hebron Hills, where activists have been forced to accompany Palestinians just as they are going to and from school or going to and from to be able to take their flocks out for grazing, owing to this ongoing harassment by settlers of Palestinian communities in the West Bank. More than 900 attacks have been documented by settlers against Palestinians in 2021 alone. 2022 was the deadliest year in terms of settler violence on record, as well as excessive use by Israeli forces against Palestinians in the West Bank since the UN started systematically documenting fatalities in 2005. The settlers, again, face total impunity. More than 90% of settlers are never charged with anything at all. And here you see a settler from the Bracha settlement in the village of Burin setting cars on fire in February 2003. In 2003, settlers also went on multiple violent rampages in Palestinian villages, which have been dubbed, I think accurately, as pogroms. Um, the settlers will enter a Palestinian village and light everything on fire, destroying Palestinian homes, injuring dozens, and killing at least one person. That was in June 2023. 400 settlers descended on Palestinian villages in Turmas Aya, near Ramallah, torching cars and homes. In February 2023, 100 plus settlers attacked the Palestinian village of Huara. Israeli settlers are oftentimes aided by the Israeli military. They killed one Palestinian and injured 350 Palestinians, while dozens of homes and businesses were set on fire. And here you see the image of a burned home in Turmas Aya from that February 2023, or excuse me, the June 2023 pogrom. Now let's talk a little bit more about the impunity that these settlers enjoy. In 81% of the communities that have been displaced from residents from their places of residence in 2022 as a result of settler violence, the residents have filed complaints and with the Israeli police, but only in 6% of these cases, were the community residents aware of any follow-up action being taken by the Israeli authorities. In other words, 94% of the time, the Israeli authorities do nothing. They don't even pursue charges, let alone convictions against these Israeli settlers carrying out acts of violence. This is another point here that more than 1,000 people in 2022 were uprooted and expelled from their homes, primarily by the Israeli settlers. They are the ones carrying out primarily the acts of violence against Palestinians and Bedouins in the West Bank that is leading, in the case of 2022, that led more than 1,000 Palestinians to be displaced. Between 2005 and 2019, Israeli police closed 91% of the complaints tracked by the Israeli human rights group Yesh Din, reported settler violence against Palestinians without indicting anyone. The Israeli army not only systematically fails to intervene, but, quote, they often provide the perpetrators escort and backup. In some cases, they also join in on the attacks. So whereas the Israeli military is supposed to be protecting Palestinians from Israeli settler violence, in fact, the opposite is much closer to the truth. They are protecting the settlers. They are escorting the settlers and backing them up. Despite the intensity of this and the scale of the February 2023 pogroms, which resulted in the death of a Palestinian and the wounding of nearly 400 more, the Israeli police recently released only 6 people were arrested in the first place, and 6 of them were released. 2 others have been issued with administrative detention orders. So we're talking about an arrest rate of less than 1% of the people who were known to have partaken in these violent pogroms. Settlements and displacement. So as we said, more than 1,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from 28 communities since 2022. That's UN data. Some 93% of the communities reported a higher frequency of settler violence since the beginning of 2022. So the settler violence is getting worse and worse. The main causes for the displacement are Palestinians are prevented from accessing their lands. So you have these shepherding communities that are unable to graze their flocks. And without being able to graze their flocks, they have no means of subsistence. So they're forced to relocate to other parts of the West Bank. They have been threatened and intimidated with violence. Their crops have been destroyed, and also their crops have been fenced around. So Israeli settlers will basically erect fences between the Palestinian population in these villages and their areas of cultivation, actually just physically preventing the Palestinians from even accessing their areas of cultivation. I also want to talk in a little bit more detail about what I would describe as really ground zero for the accusations of apartheid and the real extreme nature in which Israeli settlers and settlements have disrupted Palestinian life in the occupied territories. So in the city center of Hebron, you have 700 Israeli settlers that have taken over a large area in the downtown area, all with the support and protection of the Israeli army. The Israeli army forced hundreds of stores and commercial establishments in the city center of Hebron to shut down. The Israeli army also imposes extreme restrictions on the movement of Palestinians in this area. There are 21 permanently staffed checkpoints in Hebron, which often involve lengthy and humiliating inspections. Meanwhile, the Israeli settlers are free to go about wherever they wish, having no restrictions placed on their movement. The settlers in Hebron are involved in nearly daily physical violence and property damage against Palestinians, again, with total impunity. They often throw stones at Palestinians. They throw rubbish and excrement at their homes. They invade and destroy Palestinian homes on a regular basis. They attack children returning from school. In one such case, a 12-year-old Palestinian girl was shot and killed in the city center of Hebron. Israeli soldiers guard the Hebron settlers, protecting them as they subject the Palestinian residents of the area to systematic harassment, again, with total impunity. And I would highly recommend watching this AJ Plus documentary by Dina Takruri, which won an award around how Israeli apartheid is destroying the largest Palestinian urban center in the West Bank, which is Khalil, which is Hebron. And it's a 23-minute documentary, so we don't have time to watch it now, but I highly recommend watching that later. The JNF is the Jewish National Fund, and it's part of the government of the state of Israel. And it has purchased about 65 dunams of land in the West Bank since 1967, much of which has been used to build and expand settlements and expel Palestinians with private property. Who have private property claims on the land. The board of the JNF recently approved in 2021 a new policy that allows the organization to officially purchase land in the West Bank for Israeli settlement expansion. The JNF has also purchased land in acquisitions that have involved forgery and fraud and extortion. For example, in one land purchased in the Jericho area, millions of shekels were paid for the purchases of lands which were based on forged documents. I also want to talk in greater detail about the situation in Sheikh Jarrah, which, as you probably know, was the reason, or one of the main reasons, the main causes that led to the May 2021 war in Israel and Palestine. So about 75 families have been living under daily threat of forced displacement for decades. Every day, Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah wake up and wonder if today is going to be the day that Israeli bulldozers and Israeli soldiers come in and expel them from their homes. And it's the result of a 1970 Israeli law, which allows Jews, but of course does not allow Palestinians who lived in East Jerusalem prior to 1948 to reclaim their property if they can prove ownership. And there's one thing I want to emphasize here, which is that it's not that this 1970 Israeli law requires the actual owners of that property before 1948 to reclaim their property. It's any Jew. It's sort of like if you're Jewish, and if there was at one point Jews who owned land in East Jerusalem before 48, any Jew can then reclaim that land. It doesn't have to be the Jews that own that land. So it's this like kind of overarching ethnic policy of if you were Jewish, if the land was owned by Jews before 1948, it can be reclaimed by any Jew after 1970. But of course, Palestinians who owned land in East Jerusalem are not allowed to return to land that they once owned. 45 families living on Qarun Street are under threat of evacuation. At least 9 of them are in the process of evictions in courts. 5 others received warnings for evacuation. A number of families have already been evacuated and replaced by settlers. And you'll probably recall the very famous video that surfaced back in May 2021 of of an Israeli settler, I believe originally from New York, from Brooklyn, saying something to the effect of, "If I don't steal your land, someone else will." That was in Sheikh Jarrah. At least 11 of the families, which are in the process of eviction, 9 have already been evicted and replaced by settlers. And as I said, this became a very hot issue, a real focus point of protests in the lead up to an eviction in May 2021. That was one of the causes of that war. There's also an active attempt to push Palestinians out of Silwan, which is another neighborhood surrounding the old city of Jerusalem. About 2,800 Israeli settlers live in 140 buildings located in the heart, in this Palestinian neighborhood, which surrounds the old city and is an area home to about 100,000 Palestinians. The number of settlers living in Palestinian neighborhoods in this entire old city basin, in other words, these neighborhoods that surround the old city, has seen a 70% spike between 2009 and 2016, an increase in 39% in the number of new construction sites designated for Jews in Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. And the reason I'm focusing on this, and the reason I think it's so important, is because this is the area that Palestinians hope to create a capital, that is a capital in East Jerusalem. And it's exactly this area where you have dramatic increase in settlement expansion, especially, as I said, in Sheikh Jarrah and in Silwan, as well as in the old city of Jerusalem itself. From 2009 to 2016, 68 Palestinians, as we said, were evicted from Sheikh Jarrah, Silwan, as well as the Muslim quarter of the old city. Today, about 100 Palestinians families face eviction in Silwan. 84 of them are in the process of being evicted. 14 have already been evicted and replaced by settlers. Settlers hope to take over this neighborhood of Silwan and connect it with another area in Batan al-Hawa, which is the site of City of David, and the Al-Ad compound, which is another Israeli settlement. The ultimate goal of this area is to encircle the old city of Jerusalem with Israeli settlements. And this is done not just through expanding Israeli settlements, but also through archaeological parks. This Al-Ad settlement includes the city of David, which is a very politicized archaeological project during which Israeli archaeologists are trying to show and trying to prove, I think unsuccessfully, that this area was once upon a time, 3,300 years ago, the site of the city of David. Ateret Kohanim is one of the settler organizations that raises. It's a nonprofit organization, and if you donate to Ateret Kohanim, if you're an American, your donation is tax subsidized, so you get tax benefits for donating to the thwarting of East Jerusalem as a capital, as the future capital of the Palestinian state, and of the confiscation of Palestinian land according to racist laws. Your tax donations will be tax deductible. Ateret Kohanim, they have been actively taking over land in the Muslim quarter of the old city, working to push out the Muslims and the Christians and the Armenians, as well as the other Arab neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. They buy property from Arabs, from Greeks, from Armenians. They reportedly own more than 70 buildings in the Muslim quarter of the old city, in which they build yeshivot, which are Jewish religious seminaries. They build dormitories. They've built a museum, as well as 50 apartment units. Today, if you walk around the Muslim quarter of the old city, you can barely go a block or two without seeing Israeli flags drapered all over the Muslim quarter of the old city. I want to talk now about more recent developments. So in February and March of 2023, the Israeli cabinet retroactively approved 15 outposts. 10 of them were new settlements, 5 of them were neighborhoods of existing settlements. In April 2023, Israel announced its intention to carry out excavations and inspection work in preparation for the construction of a new road between Al Azariya and Al Zaim, which is near the settlement of Ma'ale Adumim, which is located to the east of Jerusalem. So again, very active Israeli expansion in that region located in the middle of the West Bank, connecting the northern and southern sections of the West Bank, that Israel ultimately hopes to maintain permanent military control over. In May 2023, Israel's 2023-24 budget included $920 million for road construction in the West Bank, which are going to be primarily Israeli-only roads. That is to say, roads built in occupied territory that only Israeli citizens are allowed to drive on. That's why they're called apartheid roads. the Ministry of Settlements and National Missions has budgeted 50% increase in this budget for 2024, and it also includes more money for Israeli settlement outpost expansion. You also have settler tourism that I'd like to discuss briefly. So in May 2023, the Israeli government invested $8 million to develop an archaeological park located within the Palestinian village of Sebastia, with part of it falling in areas B and C. The decision will almost certainly encourage settler tourism in this Palestinian village, placing even more Palestinians at risk of settler violence. Besides it being an archaeological city, Sebastia is a religiously significant site for both Muslims and Christians because it is believed to be the site of John the Baptist, who was baptized, who Jesus baptized in the Jordan River and is buried there. In July 2023, the Israeli government decided to invest $40 million to develop and establish at least 6 new tourist settlement sites in the West Bank. Israel in March 2023 also committed to reestablishing the Chomesh outpost, which was built on the lands of the Burka village in the northern West Bank. Recall that this was part of the area that Israel evacuated in its 2005 disengagement plan. On May 25th, 2023, Israeli settlers reestablished that post. The residents of the Palestinian village woke up to heavy mechanical equipment operating on their lands. On May 29th, 2023, the Israeli military set up a structure there, which will serve as a religious seminary. Several caravans were established there to guard the outpost. Almost all of it, again, is built on privately owned Palestinian land. The Israeli NGO Peace Now led a tour for a delegation for high-ranking diplomats in the EU. After the visit, settlers from the outpost attacked the residents of Burka to punish the local Palestinians as a result of that visit from those EU diplomats, setting fire to Palestinian houses, opening fire on Palestinians, injuring 6. In June 2023, the Israeli government official proposed a plan to expand the Sha'ar Shomron industrial zone, which is built to the west of the Israeli settlement of Ariel, which is in the north of the West Bank. This industrial zone is expected to become the largest settlement the largest industrial zone settlement in the West Bank. We're talking 2,700 dunams for Israeli industrial and commercial use. Its location is intended to create settlement continuum between the settlements and the area, and it's also intended to bring Israel's economy into the West Bank territories to support the economy of the settlements. And its location is very strategic. It's built directly on the Green Line, with the intention of blurring the distinction between Israel and the West Bank. This is another goal of the Israeli settlement enterprise, to blur the distinction between Israeli settlements and Israel proper, such that when you're driving from one area to the other, you don't even know that you're entering into an Israeli settlement. It's literally built, you don't even know because it's built on the Green Line itself. The other thing that I want to talk about is what the Israeli NGO Peace Now describes as, quote, the de jure annexation of many territories within the West Bank. So in February 2023, Israel's cabinet created the settler administration, and they transferred over powers of the civil administration to Smotrich, who is Israeli finance minister. Okay, so basically in June 2023, the Israeli government decided that the responsibilities for planning all of these new settlements would be transferred from the Ministry of Defense, in other words, from the Israeli military, to the finance minister, to the Israeli civil administration, which is Peace Now basically declares a de jure annexation of these territories, and of the settlements themselves. In other words, planning procedures would no longer require approval from the political echelons of the defense ministry, and so the prime minister's consent is no longer being required for settlement expansion. The decision also removed many of the political approvals by the Ministry of Defense that were previously needed in order to advance the expansion of new settlements. The implication of this decision is that once Minister Smotrich approves initial settlement plans in the West Bank, these plans will then be forwarded to the planning committees in the West Bank with no further government approvals needed. In July 2023, settlers established a new settlement in the heart of Hebron, expanding the Jewish presence in the city. The settlers entered a Palestinian house in Hebron that is currently, it now has current permanent settler presence. And this is how settlers expand their presence. They illegally occupy a house, and then the Israeli military comes to defend them after they've already illegally moved into it. The Jerusalem Local Planning and Building Committee has officially approved more building plans in East Jerusalem, both of which are politically significant. The first is in the southern part of the city, adjacent to Givat Hamatos. It encompasses a residential complex, 3,500 new housing units, hotel rooms, commercial and employment areas. The second plan involves the construction of a new settlement right in the heart of the Palestinian neighborhood of Ras Al-Amud, as well as close to the Palestinian village of Abu Dis, which it was the Palestinian village that was supposed to be given to the Palestinians as its capital in East Jerusalem in the 2000 Camp David negotiations. A total of 13,600 housing units have been advanced in the West Bank, as well as 18,000 new units advanced in East Jerusalem since the beginning of 2023. And I'm focusing a lot on these recent developments to give you a sense that in the past year or two, leading up to October 7th, the Israeli military and the Israeli government more generally has been on its most aggressive campaign, its most aggressive push to expand the settlement enterprise since its entire 56-year long history, beginning in 1967. And with that, I will wrap up my presentation, and we may have just a few minutes for questions, but I will pass it back to Dr. Aziz right now. Thank you so much again. And Professor Aziz, it's all you.
Thank you, Dr. Foster. Again, very richly factual presentation. What I want to also highlight is that the United States has been providing Israel with approximately $4 billion a year for the past at least 4 decades. And over time, since its establishment, the State of Israel, it has received, I believe, over $260 billion from the United States, and that money is American taxpayer dollars. It is our money. Also, Biden has just asked Congress to provide an additional $10 billion within the next few weeks. We're in December 2023 right now, in order to replenish the Israeli military's ammunitions and military capacity that is currently being targeted, that's currently targeting Palestinian civilians. So we certainly, as United States citizens and residents, have a direct role in what's happening, and depending on how charitable or pessimistic you want to be, we're either aiding and abetting, or we literally have blood on the Palestinian blood on our hands. But I do think that it's important that we all feel a sense of responsibility, that at the very least that we educate ourselves, and ideally that we engage in the advocacy that aligns with our values. And so before I take some questions, I want to encourage people to contact your elected officials and ask them to demand a ceasefire, because at this point in time, that is the most urgent need in order to stop further death and murder of Palestinians. So let me, one question was about funding, right? Funding the Israeli settlements. And if you could provide some details on that, whether it is, what is the role of US funding, but more importantly, how does Israel fund this rising, increasing, and most recent exponential growth in settlements on Palestinian land and the occupied territories?
This is just part of Israel's budgetary process every year of determining how much money to allocate to defense, how much money to allocate to social services, to healthcare, and also to settlement expansion. It's just another line item in the budget, which, owing to the, I would say, extreme right-wing nature of the current Israeli coalition, where you have Itamar Ben-Gvir and where you have Bezalel Smotrich and Bibi Netanyahu is sort of the moderate of within the coalition. Imagine that. But they are very committed to expanding the settlement enterprise, and so for them, there's no difference in spending money on the settlements as there would be on healthcare or military defense. It's just part of the Israeli budgetary process of determining how much money to dedicate to illegal settlement expansion.
And what about U.S. policy on Israeli settlements? Because we hear various narratives. On the one hand, we hear the U.S. State Department claiming that we do not support settlement building, but on the other hand, we continue to provide, or our country continues to provide aid. Can you give us an idea of, even if it's varied over time, but where does the American government officially or has officially stood on settlements over the past few decades?
The official position of the United States government has remained unchanged for decades. Is that the settlements are quote unquote unhelpful. They are an obstacle to peace. That is the official position, and yet the United States has provided Israel almost unconditional military support, unconditional diplomatic cover, despite, as you saw, Israel's never-ending and unrelenting expansion of the settlement enterprise. It's on the one hand, we think this is unhelpful, but on the other hand, we're not willing to do literally anything to prevent settlement expansion. So I think that's unfortunately the last question I'm able to take, because I do have a hard stop at 12, and I apologize for that. But thank you so much for those questions, and perhaps Professor Aziz can field the remainder of the questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Foster, for your informative presentation. And so this ends our final teach-in. However, I will encourage everyone to follow us on social media and register for the next event that we're hosting on December 14th, 2023, which will be the formal launching of our report, Presumptively Anti-Semitic, when Islamophobic tropes in the Palestine-Israel discourse, which you can also download on our website at csrr.rutgers.edu. The panel will be comprised of myself, Mitchell Plitnick, and Jonathan Matz from Jewish Voices for Peace. So thank you very much for joining us today. Please support us financially by going to csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button, and share our teach-ins widely so that more people can at least get exposed to the facts and the perspectives of Palestinians that can help counter the clearly pro-Israeli perspective that we see in American media and by the American government. And so with that, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Ma salama.